What you are hopefully looking at right here is my artistic recreation of that very same open-faced heart that you see in most all textbooks. So let's call this little section blood flow through the heart. What is very common in all lectures, mine for sure, is that a person is required to memorize the pathway of blood through the human heart, including all four chambers, all four valves, and the great vessels. Now this is not as hard as it sounds, and hopefully this little description of where the blood goes will help you maybe both in the lecture part of your course and in the lab part of your course. I'm not going to label everything here, even though I'll say the names of many of these vessels. But I will certainly, people, label the four chambers of the heart that we have, if my tablet will cooperate with me, and I think it will. So let's put a few names in. Sorry about that. Let me work with my tablet. So using my tablet, I can label the four chambers of the heart that I see here. So first, I'm going to label this one right there, which is the right ventricle. How do I know that one? Thin myocardial wall on the lateral side. Once I label the right ventricle, then the other three chambers fall into place pretty fast. This one would be the right atrium. Then over here, I have the much thicker myocardial wall of the left ventricle. And the left atrium up here. Hopefully this is just a little bit of review for everybody, but once I've labeled these four chambers, now I can start following the pathway of blood through this organ. And remember, we want to include in our memorization the four chambers, the four valves, and the great vessels. Now, I've used that term, great vessels, many times in my lecture already by this point, and I think everybody needs to have a definition of what that is. The great vessels, these are the blood vessels that are actually connected to one of the heart's chambers. I'm going to say that again. The great vessels, these are the vessels that are actually connected to one of the heart's chambers. So when we discuss great vessels, I'm just going to use a color that will stand out here, I hope. We're talking about things like the pulmonary trunk, right here, the aorta, right here, pulmonary veins, here, and the superior and inferior vena cava. Here we see the opening of the coronary sinus, which is the coronary sinus, usually not considered a great vessel, a coronary vessel. Remember that when you study these things in your lab. And we'll go through each one of these. Now, here's what I'm going to suggest you do to study, to memorize. And of course, since this is a video format for you, you can watch me 100 times if you like to. What you need to do is, at random, pick one of these heart chambers. At random, and I'll use a green dot so it stands out a little bit to start out here. Pick one of these heart chambers at random. And let's pick, just because it's nice and big right here, let's pick the right atrium. That's where we will start. The right atrium. Now, you probably already know by this point that the two atria contract, forcing the blood down into the ventricles. When you think of a typical heart sound, and that's me just making a heart sound with my throat, so that's not actually my heart beating. So when you hear a heart sound, instead of thinking lub-dub like people do, remember what I encourage you to do is to think down, out, down, out, down, out. The two atria contract, forcing blood down into the ventricles. Then the ventricles contract, forcing the blood out of the heart. Now, this is going to make a total mess out of my picture. So I suggest you trace with your finger this pathway through a picture that you're looking at from your textbook, or just watch mine very closely. So when the right atrium contracts, it forces the blood down into the right ventricle. Going through what valve? This valve right here in gray. I made the valves gray, I hope you see. With the cords on it, the chordae tendineae attached to the papillary muscles. This valve is the right AV valve, or the tricuspid valve, because it has 3 flaps in it. So from the right atrium, the blood is forced through the right AV valve / tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. The right ventricle contracts, forcing the blood out of the heart, remember. Now this blood passes through this valve right here that's associated with the right ventricle. What valve is this one? Look at your diagram. The pulmonary semilunar valve. So the right ventricle contracts, forcing the blood through the pulmonary semilunar valve into what great vessel right here? The pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk leads into my 2 pulmonary arteries, here and here, that carry the blood where? To the lungs. And that in most courses is where you go here in your cardiovascular study. So, trace along with me, everybody. It bears repeating, nice and slow. The right atrium contracts, forces blood through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. The right ventricle contracts, forcing blood up and through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk, then into the pulmonary arteries, right and left, which go to the lungs. So we've already done the right side of the heart and the great vessel right here, the pulmonary trunk, attached to the right ventricle. Now, that blood goes to the lungs, we know, to drop off carbon dioxide, to pick up oxygen. That's for your respiratory system study, not for today. But if this thing right here, and I'll go ahead and just for fun, I'll label this one for you. Let me pick a different color here. How about light blue? So if this is a pulmonary artery, going to the lungs, generally color-coded as blue because it carries deoxygenated blood, what blood vessel would carry blood back from the lungs? If the pulmonary artery goes to, who comes back? the pulmonary veins. This is just one of them. There are four. See them? 1, 2, 3, 4. I'll go back to my green color, tracing the flow of blood. So from the lungs, back from the lungs, the blood goes through the pulmonary veins. See how there are 4 generally? And these things lead all the way into and dump that blood right here into the left atrium. So now I've entered another chamber of the heart, the left atrium. And we know how it goes. That blood will be forced when the left atrium contracts through this left AV valve. Notice the AV valve is the one with the cords on it attached to papillary muscles. The left AV slash bicuspid slash mitral valve. Left AV slash bicuspid, left AV slash bicuspid slash mitral valve. Any of those names are the same for this particular valve, but when you're talking about the 2 AV valves, right and left, generally speaking in the medical world, we are talking about tricuspid on the right side and mitral on the left side are the names people like the best. Remember that. And I see a tiny flaw in my picture I think I'll fix right now. See my other semilunar valve right here? I drew that a little too high. Let's make that a little lower here because it's coming out of the left ventricle. So here we have blood in the left ventricle. The left ventricle contracts and forces that blood up into the aorta through the aortic semilunar valve. The pulmonary semilunar valve is found right at the top center of the right ventricle. The aortic semilunar valve, which is always the hard one to find on those models, is at the top center of the left ventricle, carrying blood into this big, makes the U-turn aorta, where it might go, where? Up to my head, make the U-turn, go down through my thorax, down to my foot, wherever. So the blood comes back from the lungs into the left atrium. Left atrium contracts, shoves it through the left AV slash mitral valve into the left ventricle, which contracts and forces the blood through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the aorta, another one of those great vessels. And from the aorta, where are we going? To the body, to systemic circulation. That's what we always say. To the body. Notice the path we've taken so far. We've hit all 4 of the valves and all 4 of the chambers, haven't we? Right atrium contracts, shoves blood through the right AV valve slash tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk, pulmonary arteries to the lungs. Back from the lungs in the pulmonary veins into the left atrium. Left atrium contracts, shoving the blood through the mitral slash bicuspid slash left AV valve into the left ventricle, which contracts and shoves the blood through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta, which goes to the body. How do I come back from the body? That's what these 2 vena cavas are for. Here comes that blood back, being dumped into the right atrium, like so. And notice that I'm back where I started. So let's say, just for the sake of an example, that I pump that blood up to my brain so I could get some oxygen to my neurons in my brain so I can think about this highly complex pathway of blood through the human heart. How does it come back from my brain? Well, it goes through venous circulation and will come back through that superior vena cava. What if it went down to my big toe of my right foot? Well, then it's going to come up from the body in that inferior vena cava and dump into the right atrium. You will notice, if you look closely at my picture, everybody, and let me just choose a different color here to highlight. How about purple? A couple little branches right here, see it? And right here that I created shooting off of the aorta as soon as it exits the chamber. I'm sorry that my art is not the greatest, but let me zoom in a little bit here for everyone. Down. So branching off that aorta almost immediately when it exits on the surface of the heart are the right and left coronary arteries. I just drew little sections of them so you can see them. This is how we start supplying blood to that myocardium. High oxygen, high glucose demands for all these cardiac muscle cells. Think of that when you talk about the physiology in your lecture. So the right and left coronary arteries that I drew little sections of here, left and right coronary arteries, you can see they feed the heart its blood. Coming back, we'd have venous circulation on the surface of the heart, coronary veins, the great cardiac vein, the small cardiac vein, so on, that will dump all the blood from coronary circulation back through this little opening of the coronary sinus into the right atrium. So let's not forget that the right atrium collects blood from the body as well as from cardiac or coronary circulation as well. I don't care about my Adobe Creative Cloud. So let me zoom back out here for everybody into the big picture. So generally speaking, what do the atria do? The right and left atrium. They collect blood. Blood comes into them from the lungs in the left atrium, from the body, and also coronary circulation in the right atrium. What do the two ventricles do? They pump the blood out of the heart into the pulmonary trunk, right ventricle, for the pulmonary circuit, and the aorta, left ventricle, for the systemic circuit. Now notice I did not label my great vessels here, all of them, just a couple. That's your job. That's part of what helps you study, I hope. Look at the diagram you have in your textbook. Maybe create one for yourself. Now, I drew this one. It took me maybe 5 minutes to draw this picture. But I think or hope it's a very useful picture. And just for fun, because this is practice, let's just do it one more time. Again, big mess out of my picture I can make because it's my picture, everybody. So let's throw a new color in here. Maybe, oh, I don't know. How about this one right here? Will that stand out? Oh, I think so. So let's pick a different chamber and see how this works. How about this one? The left ventricle. So I have blood in the left ventricle. Where's it going to go? Out of the heart. Through what valve? The aortic semilunar valve. Into what great vessel? The aorta. Where does it go from the aorta? To the body. How does it come back from the body? The two vena cavas. Superior vena cava, inferior vena cava. Coming back from the body. Now the blood is in the right atrium. The right atrium contracts, forcing the blood through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. The right ventricle contracts, forcing the blood through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk and then into the two pulmonary arteries. Where does it go then? To the lungs, pulmonary circulation. How do I come back from the lungs? Oh, look, right here, in the pulmonary veins, dumping into the left atrium. Remember, we have two lungs. Now the blood's in the left atrium. From the left atrium, the blood is forced through the mitral valve into the left ventricle, and that's where I started on this circuit. So my point is this: once we start doing this, describing, diagramming the flow of blood through the heart, including all four chambers, all four valves, and the great vessels, to practice this, you just pick a chamber and then trace the flow of blood until you get back to that same chamber. Because, duh, we have a circulatory system. So because our circulatory system is closed with two circuits, it doesn't matter where you start, you'll end up in the same spot again, won't you? So pick a chamber at random, trace the pathway of blood until you get back to where you started. Keep doing it over and over and over again. When you get really, really sick of it, I tell people that means you are about halfway done. Then keep doing it. So when you are presented with a question, you can answer it. Looking at this diagram, let me just throw one potential example question out for you. Blood is in the left atrium. What chamber will it go into next? Well, when you're looking at the chart like this, it's easy to see left ventricle. Let me ask you a similar question. Blood is in the left atrium. Pick the same chamber again. Blood is in the left atrium. What valve will it go through next? The mitral valve. Right here, the left AV valve. So you shouldn't miss a question like this once you've memorized the pathway that blood takes through your heart. So make sure you do it. You can watch this little video snippet as many times as you like, but make sure you know this. Starting at any point within the heart, you should be able to trace the flow of blood until you get back to that same point. That makes these questions that you're likely to see on a test pretty easy, I think.